Hi, I'm Chris. I work on HTTPS adoption efforts and usable security for Google Chrome. This talk is about the problems we face in explaining website identity to users, how our current solutions fall short, and the directions that we think are most promising going forward. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep things a little bit high level, but the full details are available in our paper. So what is website identity? To browsers, the principal notion of website identity is the origin of the page. This is the tuple of scheme, host, and port. And this is the backbone of the web security model. The origin is also a key website identity indicator that we show to users of browsers to tell them what site they're on. Browsers show the origin prominently in the location bar with different ways to try to highlight the domain part of it, kind of the key piece. In addition to showing the origin, for about a decade now, browsers have shown special UI for extended validation, or EV certificates. An EV certificate associates a website or domain with a legal entity whose name and jurisdiction is typically displayed alongside the URL in the location bar. Users can check the EV indicator to verify that a website is associated with a legal entity that they know and trust. So previously in Chrome, we've looked at simplifying connection security indicators, and our focus there has been to reduce our reliance on positive security indicators. For positive indicators to protect a user, the user has to notice their absence. And in general, we found that this is just not very natural for users. And the web ecosystem has mostly moved to HTTPS by default. It's the default expectation of a user. You kind of hope that everything out there uses HTTPS. So it's much less notable that a site has a lock next to it in the Omnibox or the location bar. And we like it that way. We want the web to be HTTPS. So instead, we've focused on the cases that matter with negative security indicators as much as possible. So for the treatment of HTTP pages, we actively call it out as not secure. And when a user starts entering data in a form, we downgrade this indicator even more to draw their attention to it. When a user does something potentially risky, we should make that clear to them. And when we really know that something is going wrong, we try to help the user avoid it with clear calls to action, like with our certificate error, the phishing error here, or our malware errors. To reframe this with a non-browser example, a check engine light turns on when things are failing, rather than an engine OK light turning off. When things are going well, which would you rather see? And which would you be more likely to notice when things go wrong? So while we can rely on safe browsing to help us actively warn users about known threats like phishing sites and malware, we're currently reliant on existing website identity indicators for basically all other cases. So we show the user the origin in the location bar, or for sites with EV certs, we also show the organization name and jurisdiction. Except for Safari, which stopped showing the organization name in fall 2018, and now only shows the host name, but in green. Anyway, for these positive website identity indicators to work, users have to notice when they're missing or different than expected. You only have to miss the positive indicator once on PayPal to get phished. Another complication with EV, specifically, is that we've seen a number of realistic proof of concept attacks against EV certs, such as the Stripe Inc. meme collision attack shown here, where a perfectly valid EV certificate was issued for a Stripe in a different state than the popular payment processing company. As Ian Carroll recently recounted on Mozilla DevSec policy, he did this over lunch in high school for $177. This results in basically identical UI in browsers. Another example attack is someone getting an EV certificate for a company named Identity Verified. This then gets shown prominently in browser UI to users. Additionally, I will note that the EV guidelines specifically say that the purpose of EV is not to verify that the holder is law-abiding, trustworthy, or safe. So given all of this, we wanted to evaluate whether current site identity indicators help users? The simplest question to ask is whether the absence of the EV UI affects user behavior. To do this, we ran a large-scale field experiment in Chrome where we stopped showing the EV UI to a sample of users. So in the control condition, we showed the EV UI. In the treatment condition, we didn't. And we wanted to see whether this has any effect on a whole slew of user metrics that we collected. So these are things like navigation behavior, form behavior, interactions with autofill, interactions with the security indicator and page info, downloads started on the page, and overall engagement with sites. And in the end, we found that it doesn't really have an effect on user behavior. We found little evidence that the absence of the EV indicator affected how users interact with sites. So after our field study in Chrome, we wanted to dive deeper into how and why users understood site identity indicators. To do this, we performed a series of online experimental surveys. In the first, we showed popular financial site login pages to users in a screenshot, but with some tweaks. So remember that the EV UI includes the country of jurisdiction in a 2-letter country code to try to disambiguate which legal entity is actually being referred to. So PayPal is a US company, so it says US. We swapped out the country code of jurisdiction on PayPal for participants in the US and HSBC for participants in the UK to see if participants would notice. And we asked them how comfortable they were logging in and why. We also asked participants to click on the screenshot to point to what elements informed their comfort or discomfort that made up that decision. And across all of our conditions, we found no significant difference in participants' recorded comfort levels. We showed different country codes, or we omitted the country code entirely. So here's a heat map for where participants clicked on the HSBC login page. But the Great Britain country indicator has been swapped for RU. The main hotspots here are the lock icon, that's the huge red circle, trailed by HTTPS, the protocol scheme in the URL bar, and then the word security in the URL, and then various things within the content area on the page. So compare it to the heat map for the unmodified UI. This is HSBC with the EV indicator with GB country code. The results are basically the same. Or compare to the results for PayPal with an RU country code. Participants clicked on the lock icon, the HTTPS scheme, PayPal in the URL, and the PayPal logo in the content area. So US participants were most likely to describe feeling familiar with the web page. PayPal is well known, so it makes me feel somewhat comfortable. While UK participants most commonly pointed to an HTTPS indicator, like the HTTPS along with the padlock in the address bar, but not EV-specific UI. Only a few noticed oddities in the page's country code. Even when they did notice, it didn't necessarily make them uncomfortable. For example, I never noticed the MX on a PayPal page, but it seems legit. So while our first studies focused on Chrome, because we had access to make changes in Chrome and we knew what to test for, we weren't the first movers in this space. And so we wanted to see how users reacted to other modern browsers' EV UI. Specifically, as I said before, in the fall of 2018, Apple's Safari browser removed the legal entity name in their location bar and simply started showing the host name in green instead. So we ran another online survey experiment similar to our previous one to assess user comfort on the login pages with the old UI and the new UI. We found no significant difference in participants' comfort levels across both conditions in the US and the UK. So we used PayPal and HSBC again, showed them the old and the new UI, no difference. Interestingly, participants were a bit split as to whether the EV indicator made them feel comfortable or uncomfortable in the Safari UI. So to point this out, in Safari, in the old UI, the URL was not shown at all for sites with EV certs, only the legal entity name. So some users said things like, looks like the genuine page, but I'd like more reassurance of this, like being able to see the URL. So what made users feel comfortable or uncomfortable logging in? Here's another heat map of UK participants showing the HSBC login page. And in the old UI condition with the legal entity name, they primarily pointed to the lock icon, and then the HSBC text in the location bar, in part of the EV name, and then the HSBC UK logo in the content area. For participants in the new UI condition, which just showed the host name, they again primarily pointed to the lock icon, and then the host name, and then the HSBC UK logo in the content area, as well as some of the security advisory buttons down lower in the content area. OK, so that's EV, but what other ways do we express site identity to users? The core one for the web, the one that makes up the security model, is the origin of the URL. But as with the EV indicator, past research has found that users don't often notice URLs, or they don't really use them to make security decisions. They don't factor into their mental models very well. So users are left having to parse these potentially complicated syntaxy strings with all of these symbols to make sure they're on the right site. So we wanted to ask the question, does highlighting or extracting different parts of the URL as we display it to users help them understand site identity better? So we conducted another survey experiment to learn whether more pronounced URL formatting changes in the browser address bar could help draw attention to the URL and help users understand its security properties. So we showed participants a page with a Google sign-in form and a non-Google URL. Specifically, the registrable domain in this URL is tinyurl.com with a whole bunch of noise on both sides of it. And we randomly assigned participants to one of 7 conditions. So we have conditions that are roughly like we display it today, and a whole bunch of variations where we highlighted the registrable domain, or we hid other non-relevant parts of the URL, we bolded the registrable domain, we did all sorts of things. And we asked participants first to identify the website that they were being showed, and then asked them if they would be comfortable entering their login credentials on the site. Few participants noticed anything strange about the website when they were asked to identify it. About 85% of all participants just said the site is Google. When asked why they reported feeling somewhat or very comfortable with the page, the majority of responses described looking at cues in the content area. This looks like a legitimate Google sign-in form. Participants justified their comfort by saying the page looked familiar or that they trusted Google's security. Notably, even in open-ended responses where participants appear to have been looking at the URL, they didn't necessarily notice any oddities. Of all the variations that we tested, showing only the registrable domain left aligned next to the lock icon stood out as the most distinct. Users cited oddities in the URL and general safety concerns at a disproportionate rate compared to other conditions. But when we actually did statistical significance testing on it, it's still not statistically significant. So what now? We try all of these things with our existing identity indicators, but kind of based on our results here and our review of prior research in the space, we think we need more radical redesigns in how we think about website identity indicators and how we communicate this information to users to help them make security decisions. So a decade of EV UI still falls short due to users not noticing a lack of positive indicators. Our results showed that users don't act differently in its absence, suggesting that an EV certificate does not provide a good defense against phishing or social engineering. Some users may not notice it. Some users may notice it, but they don't base security decisions on it. And our survey results suggest that recent proof of concept attacks would likely be effective against users in the wild if adversaries started using them. And simple URL tweaks don't seem to be enough to make URLs good site identity indicators for the average user. But at the same time, the origin of the page is our fundamental security boundary on the web. So to try to be a little bit forward-looking, I suggest we should prefer active negative indicators to passive positive indicators. We should try to apply the same lessons that we learned working on connection security indicators to identity indicators. Again, a user only has to not notice the lack of a positive indicator once to lose. So while we've kind of figured out connection security indicators, it's an open problem of how do we think about negative indicators when it comes to identity. An example of something that Chrome is experimenting with is our new lookalike warning, which tries to help users when we think they might be on a confusing URL. So we currently have this for URLs that a user has previously visited and they try to visit something similar but not quite. We'll try to guide them to where we think they were trying to go. So instead of showing them a DNS host not found error or them landing on a phishing page, we try to route them to the real URL. And by showing an interstitial warning page, we bring this to the attention of the user before the content of the page is shown, which was often cited by participants in our studies as motivating their comfort with a potentially malicious page. And we give the user a clear call to action that will get them back to a known site. So we're still exploring and expanding these kinds of protections, and there's definitely more things and more research that we haven't thought even to try yet. So we should think about prominent UI as valuable space in the browser. This can benefit us both by focusing user attention on things that matter, and also as an opportunity for user education. We can draw their attention to things when it really matters. In comparison, the EV UI can take up a lot of space in the Omnibox, especially for sites with long legal entity names like the Washington Post. So while prior attempts at user education about identity indicators has been mixed in the past, we think if we start opening up to more radical ideas, we might be able to help focus user attention when it matters. And finally, through anything that we work on and propose and try to roll out, we should focus on user research so that we understand the impact of website identity indicators as they're coming out. And we understand whether we're actually helping users understand the sites they visit. So both telemetry and user studies give us unique insight into whether and how users understand and use them. So while current website identity indicators may fall short, we hope to see interesting new ideas for helping users understand website identity and for keeping users safe on a vibrant, healthy web ecosystem. Thank you.
All right, time for a couple of questions. I have to fix my engine light when I go home. But
thank you for the talk, Nick Nikiforaki, Stony Brook. So about near the end, you suggested some potential negative indicators. You may already know this. So I think 6 or 7 years ago, AdBlock Plus tried to protect its users by essentially flagging when they were about to visit a URL that was similar, right? It may have been like a lower ranked URL compared to another URL with a Levenshtein distance of 1 that was much higher ranked, right? And they had a slew of complaints, right, from benign companies that happened to be close to a popular domain, right, but just lower ranked, because essentially they would stop users from actually visiting them, right? So I think you need to take a great deal of care here, because you may end up penalizing the small guys, right, who are actually low in Alexa rankings and just happen to be syntactically close to the popular domains.
Yes, so this is a very good point. And this is part of why we're approaching these things slowly and carefully. So one way that when we're rolling these out is we're very careful about analyzing false positives, actually looking at what kinds of sites would this trigger on, setting our heuristics appropriately, and monitoring things in the wild of how it's triggering. Right. The other part is the way it currently works is it's entirely based on users' prior browsing history, basically. So we're doing it locally on the client. And if you've previously visited and engaged with a site, then this will never trigger on that site.
Right. Can I ask one more question? OK, I will go to the back.
Hi. Richard Roberts, University of Maryland. I was hoping, could you go into a little bit more detail about how you compare a particular domain, the similarity of that domain to a domain that a user may have previously visited before?
Yeah, so the simplest heuristics are things like being off by a character. So the particular example on this is not something that I implemented, so I can't list off the top of my head the full set of heuristics, but I'm happy to chat more offline. Yeah.
Hi, Tim Cowan, Sigtigo. So you use the example of the check engine light, and this reminds me, of course, of the not secured message, which is the, are you considering doing something similar with verified identity? So there would be an indicator that the identity of this business is not known, and then that would be absent if the identity is known?
So there is a whole slew of policy and verification things that we think fall a little short. And there's definitely a wide range of potential future options in the space of what is actually useful to a user to tell them when something is missing that is expected in terms of identity verification, or trying to actually build mappings to entities that actually matter to users. But that's a really hard problem that we need engagement with the entire ecosystem to try to come up with something that might actually work.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Chris.